Right, so let's start talking a little bit about adding value to our paintings in a conscious way. Now, what the heck is value? So a lot of the times people think that value is just another word for saturation or contrast. But the truth is, no matter how good you are at what you do, it is very easy to forget just how much of an impact your value scale has on your finished product. So value is something that you find in black and white images more emphatically, because you can see the actual contrast between the lightest tones and the darkest tones. But it can also be found in something that is monochromatic or duochromatic, like this image. And it can be found in something so crazy as this one. So basically, the value is the contrast between your lightest lights and your darkest darks. If you take an image like this, there's a massive contrast, and there are very few tones that lie between your lightest tone and your darkest tone. So this is something with fewer values on the scale. Whereas something like this appears a little more gray because the contrast is very low, which means there are a ton of values between the lightest tones and the darkest tones. So how to find out the value in a piece? It's very simple. Just take an image, any image, add some witchcraft and convert it to black and white, and there you go. That's how you judge your value scale. So here you can more clearly see the lightest tone and the darkest tone and all of the tones that lie between, because saturation is not a factor. So the number one confusion about value is, isn't a darker color just a more saturated version of a color? And that is not true. So here you can see a regular spectrum that you can find on many drawing softwares, Photoshop, whatever. And this here you can clearly tell that on the left it is basically just a grayscale, and the top right corner is the brightest red. So the reason that value and saturation are not the same is because of this. From the left to right, you get a more saturated color, whereas from top to bottom, you have an increase in value, which means at different levels of value, you have different saturations of color. So saturation is basically just a more pigmented version of any value. So a better way to illustrate this is to take two colors that lie on the same value, and they have different saturations. But when you convert them to grayscale, you'll find that actually it's the same shade of gray. And that's how you can best understand the difference between value and saturation. So let's look at good values and bad values. And yes, there are good and bad values, but it's not what you think. So playing with contrast can be incredibly fun. And here's the impact it has on your work. So here are two drawings that I made using the same exact pencils, the same exact paper, same exact lighting conditions, all of that. But clearly one of these is nicer and more attractive than the other, and we all know it's the one on the right. But if you play with the contrast just a little bit, you get this. And here you can see her face is so much more pretty or more attractive to look at. It's mostly because our eyes don't really see values as absolutes. Instead, we see it relative to the lightest or darkest tone. So if there is a much stronger contrast, it makes some of her features stand out much better. So here the eyes look really beautiful and dark, and her smile is really bright, and her hair is a really good frame for the rest of her face, and her jaw is a lot more chiseled. And so obviously now that they are both at a similar level of contrast, you can't really tell if one of them is necessarily better than the other, because they're both really pretty. But contrast is in everything. So here's my baby. This was my very first digital painting ever, and I am so proud of it. Mostly because I had no digital painting experience before this, and for a first ever attempt, this to me is pretty impressive. Well done, Srish. But if you convert it to black and white, you'll find that actually your eye is drawn more to her headdress and the background and her clothes, rather than her face, which should be the focus of all your attention. And this is because there are no tones in her face. There is no value. All you can see is white and black and maybe like 2 shades of gray. And that kind of irritates the eye a little bit because it is not as real looking as it should be. So on the other end of the spectrum is this drawing, which when you convert it to grayscale, you can see there are a lot more tones. There is still a decent contrast, which means that you're still drawn to her eyes and her mouth and her hair. But at the same time, there are a few values between the darkest and lightest shades, just enough to make the whole portrait more dimensional and more deep. So contrast isn't everything, but it can make or break a piece. Maybe many shades of grey is a good idea. But is there such a thing as too many values? Now, this is a question that haunts people who work with realistic or hyper-realistic work, because here you can see that many values are needed to add all the little details, especially in the skin around the eye, to make it look more realistic, to give it much more dimension and depth. But at the same time, here you can see that I may have added way too many values, especially in the background, that dulls the contrast just a little bit. So too many values can be very distracting and they don't really lead the eye as well as having a good contrast. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, how can you practice your value skill? Basically, you observe visually pleasing pieces, other artists' work, other pictures, and you try and replicate it in your own work. I am not telling you to plagiarize. All I'm saying is to use references to understand and increase your knowledge of values. So you can start with something as basic as a value sphere, where you imagine that there is one light source and you try to see where the lights and shadows would fall on a sphere. And you can work with texturing here, you can work with shadows, you can understand how 3 dimensions look on a 2D image. And once you're used to this, once you feel very confident, you can go and do something much more complex, a lot more texturized, like material studies. Personally, I think this is the best way to understand how value works on different surfaces. So this is definitely something that you want to try out. So just to sum up really quickly, basically value is the difference between your darkest tones and your lightest tones, but most importantly, it is how many steps lie between your blackest black and whitest white. Light and shadow is something you need to consider before you put your colors in, before you put your saturation in, because when you switch to grayscale, you should still be able to see a clear image. Do not abuse contrast like I did on my very first digital painting, because it just takes away all of the little details. It takes away all the varying interest points from your piece. And finally, practice. Practice until you can no longer stand to see anything in black and white. Honestly, there is nothing that will teach you better than repetitive work.